going to record. Some people are having some issues with Wi-Fi, so what art styles influenced early Renaissance architecture? Who can share? Once again, based on visual evidence. So Jasmine said Roman style. What are some Roman characteristics of this? We need specifics. So visual evidence should be specific. Who can give me something specific? We have rounded arches, right? So you can see the difference between Gothic. Gothic would be pointed, right? We have the reemergence of rounded arches. We have domes, good. We have dome ceilings. Is there anything Greek about this? Anything Greek? We have classical Greek columns with Corinthian capitals. We have entablatures. We have pediments. There's a little triangular pediment above the doorway here as well. Okay, so this is not the Ruselle Palazzo, but this is the Medici Palace. And so you probably have heard about the Medicis before in other classes. These were bankers and business people of Florence who had tremendous power, and they became major patrons to the arts. Even today, often people use the word Medici to describe someone who's a patron. All right, someone who gives money, donates money for good causes or for education. And so this humble abode, right, is supposed to be a modest house for the Medicis, created by Michelozzo, an architect and contemporary of Brunelleschi. And so how is power conveyed, right? How is power conveyed? It is enormous. It is enormous. The Medicis actually went, they broke Florentine building code, because the building was not supposed to be so ostentatious. It wasn't supposed to be so enormous. They actually demolished, I think, 14 homes in order to build this palace. And so even when we look at it, we're like, it's big, but it has some characteristics that are typical of the Renaissance or Classicism. And so it's got kind of this sturdiness to it that feels medieval, but it does have rounded arches, right? It does have a pronounced cornice. Look at this cornice that juts out. That's very Roman. And then it has rounded arches, okay? And it has a sense of order to it. Notice it has those three sort of levels to it. It has a rustification. So this roughness that you see on the stone is supposed to make it seem more modest. And so like a Roman house, it's very common that business took place in the first story. So the Medicis would have business, the doorways, you can see that they're kind of open and large. I think Michelangelo designed these doorways, if I remember right. And then the second story was kind of for entertaining, and the third story was for private living quarters. So very similar to what we've seen in other homes. The Medici had an atrium. So we've talked about atriums before. These are these open spaces. So inside the center of the building, there's kind of like this garden area. And if you notice, there's these podiums. So young Michelangelo, as well as many other art history or artists, they would be, their patronage would be of the Medici. And so they would go into their home and be able to see works of art. They would see the latest and greatest artworks. They'd be able to meet poets and musicians and contemporaries, and they would learn about things like Neoplatoism and other sort of philosophical beliefs existing. And so Michelangelo got to observe at the age of 14, these great works that were kept in this atrium area. And so when you walk around the city of Florence today, you often see the coat of arms of the Medici. They have oranges, so that's what those spheres are, they're oranges, and then you often see these keys on a shield. All right, so this is very similar to Micheloso's Medici Palazzo. This is the Ruselle Palazzo, and the architect here is Leon Batista Alberte. Alberte was very much inspired by classical Rome in his architecture, and so he researched. So what's classical about this, right? This actually has a little bit more classical characteristics, even more so than what we just saw in the last piece. What's classical about it? You can join in the audio. It's much faster than typing. What do you think, Jason? Give me one. Jason? How is it classically inspired?
Above like the windows, there's like arches.
Right, so we have rounded arches. Even the windows themselves have those little, they have like a big arch of masonry, and then they have little ones of, it might be stucco. I don't think it looks like windows from here, but it could be glass as well. Anything else about this seem classical? Right? It has, in this kind of flat exterior, it actually has a lot of classical tendencies. It has projected cornice. So notice how that cornice really sticks out from the building. That's something that comes from Rome. It has 3 entablatures. So it's got, and cornices on top of it. So it has 3 of those as well. It has pilasters. Instead of having columns, it has pilasters. And so on the first story, it's in Tuscan order. And the reason I say it's Tuscan and not Doric is it does have a base. Then it has Ionic, and then it has Corinthian. So it's very similar to the kind of order that we saw on the Colosseum, right? It has in the entablature garlands. So just like at the Arapacis on the inside, how there's this swag, or on the top of a Corinthian column, there's also often acanthus. There's this organic material that decorates it. We have Jason's rounded arches, and then we have horizontal elements rather than vertical elements. Gothic was all about height, right? This emphasis on height and light. And in the Renaissance, we often have more horizontal sort of elements to them, especially in Italy. Okay, so here we can see the side of it. This is a loggia. So loggias would be open air art galleries. So you could put sculptures out there. Today it's a shoe store, so this glass was not original, right? This was not original, but this would be an area you'd be able to view. And so you can see here how raised, right? Can you see how raised it appears? Right? It's kind of faux because of course the door is not raised. There's no stairs, elevated stairs to kind of get you inside the palazzo. So palazzo is like a palace in Italian, right? So Alberte, he studied art and architecture in Rome, and he wrote a very important treaty. So he wrote, the one that's probably most connected for us is a treatise on architecture. And he wrote about Vitruvius. Vitruvius we've mentioned a few times. What did Vitruvius think was perfect? Vitruvius. I'll give you a hint. We see elements of it at the Pantheon. What's perfect? Isabel or Isabella. What's perfect?
Geometry.
Geometry. In specifically a circle and a square. right? So a circle and a square. So he wrote about that. And so this idea of measure and harmony was very characteristic of his work. There's a video that you guys can watch on Smart History to get even more connection with this piece. I'm not going to take time to do that today. So I would highly recommend that for you if you haven't already done so, right? So you can see that it's kind of a more refined version of the Medici Palace, which was probably an influence. It came earlier. All right, this is a church by Alberte, and even though when we look at it, it's not exactly based on circles and squares, it does have a lot of classical tendencies to it. So I want to make sure I mention this, and I probably should have said it when we looked at Brunelleschi as well, is that churches, right, don't typically look like Greek pagan temples, right? And so the fact that we've had a lot of time to kind of forget that Roman temples are based on paganism. And remember, the Christians would often adopt style from, you know, other cultures. So they adopted basilicas. But by the time of the Renaissance, you know, they're so far removed from that paganism that they think, okay, we want to revere the classics. We want to revive the classics. And so they don't even think about the fact that these temples once were pagan-like. And so here, the front of, I think it's Sant Andrea, if I remember right, has a pediment, right? It's got rounded archways. It has what we call a colossal order. So instead of the columns just being one story, notice how they go all 3 stories here for the size of the church. And then when we look on the inside, Alberte in his treatise said that the perfect church would be a central plan church, right? Based on a circle and a square. However, that's not what, you know, religious leaders of the day wanted. They wanted, you know, processionals. So even though it's not a central plan church, you can see the reflection of circles and squares in his architecture, right? Notice the shape of the crossing. Perfect square with a circular dome above it, right? And then this is the interior of it. I said Sant Andrea, but my memory fails me. I want to make sure I'm not misspeaking to you guys. Not that it's in the 250 anyway, but let's see. Sorry, I'm like looking at my notes here, and it's not letting me look. So I'm just wasting time on you. Anyway, but you can see how the interior feels like the inside of like a Roman bath. And it has the coifred ceilings and the barrow vaults. And so you can see how this is very much a departure from Gothic architecture. Okay, so now we're going to look at the influence of classicism on sculpture. Okay, so in the city of Rome, there is a building called Orson Micheli. And Orson Micheli was a civic building. So it was not necessarily, you know, like it wasn't a city hall, it wasn't a church, it was basically a building where a lot of the guilds had their offices. And so on the exterior of it, it's not a very impressive structure. It used to be a granary. So it was kind of simple, kind of, it's basically like stone, but it had a bunch of niches in it. And the niches were all done in sculpture and architectural relief. And they were all done by famous artists of the day. And each of the different guilds, right, would basically decorate these different niches. So one of the guilds was a sculpture guild. And so here you can actually see that there are these 3 kind of master sculptors in the middle, but then at the very bottom, right, in relief, like there's a lintel there, in relief, we have them making sculpture. Right? So can you see like the artisans at work at the bottom? And so it's kind of like a cross between Renaissance and Gothic, right? The classical drapery, right, of this architect, of this sculptor, I think his name was Nico Banini, it's very classical, right? It's got contrapposto, it's got classical drapery, but it's set in a very Gothic niche. You guys see the pointed arch with all those little like flourishes and, you know, thin details, right? And so we can see that some of the classicism from like France in the Gothic was happening in Italy as well, right? So we are going to be working on our first of our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We have our first one, which is Donatello. Donatello is the only early Renaissance artist. The other three are high Renaissance artists. Okay, so Donatello was a master sculptor. He was good at multiple medias. So he was good at stone, he was good at bronze, he was good at wood. And he too did one of these niches for Orson Michele. This one is for the Metalsmith Guild. So you can see that he has this gigantic shield, and he probably also once upon a time had a real sword and possibly a helmet on his head to show the workmanship of the guild. And so in the very base of this, he has St. George slaying a dragon, right? So this is supposed to be St. George here. And you can see him slaying the dragon. This has a characteristic that we call schemato. And so basically what this is atmospheric perspective in sculpture, right? So atmospheric perspective we saw with the Romans, right? Do you guys remember Roman painting, right? What happens in atmospheric perspective as something gets farther and farther away? What happens? It gets hazier. So notice how the details get softer as it goes back into space. And so once again, remember that the Renaissance is looking at the real world and trying to recreate it. So this idea of observing the actual world, making things look realistic, is very much Renaissance characteristic. This is Zirconi, it means pumpkin head. This was actually created for the Florentine Cathedral, and his head is so big because he would have been seen from way up high and kind of looking down. And so he's kind of exaggerated. This is kind of the masterfulness of Donatello, is that he really thought intentionally about how the viewer would see the work. And if you were seeing this from 100 feet away, you would have to exaggerate the features, exaggerate the folds of the fabric, exaggerate the posture so that the message could be viewed from a distance. Okay, that leads us to our David by Donatello. Okay, so we don't have Michelangelo's David in the 250. They use the Sistine Chapel for him instead. So what we're going to do is have our David from Donatello, right? And so let's think about our theme, right? How does this David image reflect the theme of humanism and classicism? So to help remind us, since it's been a few days, it feels like longer, right? I have our early Renaissance theme here, and I have our David. What are the characteristics in this David image that you can see? Let's go with the other Isabel. Can you give me one? So I called on Isabella, now it's calling it Isabel.
I would say like the anatomy is, it's sort of contrapposto, like.
So he's got anatomy, first of all. So this is one of the very first resurgence of the classical nude. We haven't seen the classical nude or a nude figure really other than maybe Adam and Eve, right? And that's there to create this element of sin, right? And of course, we also know that in Genesis, they describe them as being nude, right? So it makes sense that they be nude. So we have the reemergence of the classical nude, and he is standing in contrapposto, so that we definitely do have that classical tendency. And so that inspiration of classical Greece, that second bullet point, is good. Anything else? What about humanism? Mention that idea of humanism, not just classical tendencies. What's his attitude? What do you think his attitude is? Varun, what do you think?
Sorry, you're breaking up. Could you like repeat that again?
I was going to say, what about his attitude recalls humanism?
He's like very like natural, and he has like the contrapposto and like same pose.
Right? So he has a natural pose, and in contrapposto, it's kind of relaxed. Now, what's his arm is up high, right? And what is he standing on? Does anyone know?
Is that a turtle?
No, I can see why you would think so. It's the head of Goliath. So I'll describe the story in just a second. But he's standing on the head of a giant that he just slayed, right? So he has a sense of confidence, doesn't he? Right? So humanism is this idea that man can achieve, right? So he has a sense of confidence because he just conquered a giant, right? He just conquered a giant. And so let's think about other classical tendencies. Would you say he's proportional? Is he he's classically proportioned? Very good. We don't have perspective here. It's not painting. There's no architectural elements to it. But it does have that attention to a sense of realism. So let's go through just a little bit of backstory. Okay, so in the Old Testament, there's the story of the David and Goliath. David is King David, who eventually writes Psalms, right? So he is King David. He is a family member of Jesus. Mary actually comes from his lineage, okay? And so David was a shepherd boy in his youth, and he had a bunch of older brothers, and they were part of this army. And so basically, they had this conquering group that was coming in, and they had a ringer. They had this giant named Goliath who was demolishing everyone. And so they were like, they didn't know what else to do. They didn't have anyone else to go in and try to defeat Goliath. And so this child, basically, this teen, David, said, well, I kill lions and wolves and all these things all the time because I protect my sheep. I have my slingshot, and also God's going to help me, all right? And so basically he uses his slingshot, hits Goliath right in the head, and kills him, right, with a rock. And so this idea of young, small David becomes a symbol of Florence. So if you remember when we talked about the rise of the Renaissance in Florence, we have not just the resurgence of classical study and this rebirth of classicism. We also have this concept of humanism being developed because the smaller city of Florence was able to defeat a much greater, a much more powerful, and much more rich city of Milan. So David becomes a symbol of the city of Florence. And that's another reason why Michelangelo carves his very famous image of David, right? So humanism is that we have this proud victory of Florence over Milan. We have it as being pride of the city and the republic, as well as this sense of confidence in the image. This was a commission by the Medici. So the Medici commissioned this to be made. It has these classical tendencies that we mentioned, but it also has that sense of the ideal nude. It has a sense of perfection to it, as well as it is the first life-size bronze piece since the antiquity. So we have a life-size classical nude as well, right? So here we have it from the different directions. You can see the contrapposto here, but also you get to see a little bit more of the power of, or how he portrays power, right? So we mentioned how he's standing on the head, right? He's standing on the head of Goliath, and the head of Goliath is on what? What is that thing down there? Any ideas what the thing on the base is? Eva, can you tell what that thing at the very bottom is?
No, I don't know.
It's a victory wreath, right? And so remember at the column of Trajan, how there's the weapons and victory wreaths and whatnot at the very base. And so that's very much a Roman sort of characteristic. So remember that the Renaissance is a rebirth of ancient Rome, of classical Greece. They wanted to show that they were just as powerful, as knowledgeable, as great as this classical period. And so we have David being shown as powerful, where he has his foot on his head. He has a sword. He has a shield. He's standing on the rock. We have him as the symbol of Florence, but he also is a symbol for the Medici, and to show the greatness and the power of the Medici, and the fact that the Medici were educated and could commission such a wonderful piece, right? And so how it represents the ideals of the Renaissance, it's a revival of classicism, this idea of the calm, cool, collected face, right? The ideal body, the nude body, contrapposto, it's life size. It's also kind of sensual in that he has kind of that extreme contrapposto to him that's a little bit more characteristic, like late classicism, right? And the fact that it's also in the home of this very wealthy family. So this would have been displayed on one of these podiums out in the courtyard. And supposedly there was a walkway that led to this courtyard, to this atrium, and you could see this from the street. So people, as they walked across the street, could look into the atrium of the Medici and see this symbol of Florentine pride. Right? This is another Donatello. And so the reason I show you this is the reemergence of equestrian monuments. Remember the Marcus Aurelius that we saw before in ancient Roman time? So there was a lot of artists that did this kind of style of these monumental equestrian images of the time, where they would have powerful horses and then the riders that were commanding them. This is a later piece by Donatello in wood. And so I mentioned that Donatello could do bronze, which we just saw. We saw earlier pieces in stone. This is a good example of his wood. And so he chose the media based on whatever the quality was supposed to be of the piece. So this is an image of Mary Magdalene, right? And she's kind of dressed like a hermit here. She's very emotional, right? She's kind of displayed in a very emotional sort of way. And so he thought that the fluidity of wood, right, that he could carve it in a much more organic manner, was the perfect media for a piece like this. So he thought carefully about, do I want to use bronze? Do I want to use stone? Do I want to use, wood, based on the emotive quality of the piece, right? And so people like Giotto and Donatello, like, this is kind of revolutionary, right? This is why these guys are often, considered like Renaissance men, is because they're kind of moving past and they're starting to think, like an artist, right? They're not just these lowly craftspeople who might get mentioned, but have no name, we don't even have the names of a lot of those. This is Alberte's Gates of Paradise. Remember, he won this commission over Brunelleschi. If you look up it close, in some of the panels, you can see elements of early Renaissance characteristics. Notice the perspective to show the depth, right, in the architectural relief, but we also have classical drapery, focus on anatomy, look at those legs, right? And then this is Verruccio. The only reason I bring this up is when you go around the city of Florence, you'll see often this little putti. He is in Palazzo Vecchio, the city hall of Florence, and we have this little putti holding a dolphin, and you see it everywhere, like recreations of it, all the souvenirs. But he also did this equestrian monument. I think his is in Venice, though, if I remember right. This is Gattamelado. He was basically like a gun for hire. So he was a mercenary. He was a hired army general, right? And then this is, oh golly, now I can't remember his name either. This is an example of a table piece. So sculptures didn't have to be just life size. They could be small and fit on a tabletop. And this is something that is viewed from all different directions. A lot of sculpture that we've seen up to this point is really just viewed from the front. In the Renaissance, a lot of these pieces could be viewed all in 3 dimensions. Okay, so we're going to move into painting and look at classical traditions of 15th century painting. So once again, when we talk about 15th century, we really talk about the 1400s. Right, so remember that this concept of PMA, positive mental attitude, but also perspective modeling anatomy is probably seen the most in painting, right? Because you can probably include as much of this in it as possible, right? To show depth, we can use linear perspective. We can see modeling and anatomy to make things look 3D, but also to idealize them. And then there still is a sense of perfect mathematical ratio in the proportions of the figures, as well as the proportions of the background to the imagery. This is Masaccio. And the only reason I bring this up is it has a good use of linear perspective to show depth, right? And so Masaccio is probably one of those artists that should be in the 250, that's not. And when you look at this image of the Holy Trinity, it is on a flat wall, right? It's done in fresco. And notice how he uses the linear perspective where the vanishing point is at the base of Jesus's feet to create a barrel vaulted extension of this chapel, right? And so he creates space, he creates visual depth using the linear perspective that Brunelleschi discovered. And this was very characteristic. This is Masaccio, and Masaccio influenced Michelangelo. Michelangelo grew up and studied in Florence, and so he would have known of Masaccio's painting, and he references this image of Adam and Eve with this angel in the Sistine Chapel, and so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to show it to you. But one of the things we start to see is that he starts to create much more realistic scale when it comes to architecture and landscape in relationship to the people. So if I go to like Giotto's example from the Arena Chapel, notice how it's not really like as much architecture or landscape in miniature. It's much more proportional to the size of the figures. Does that make sense? So in the Renaissance, with this attention to detail, we're able to make things look much more realistic. So the next piece that we have is Frau Filippo Lippi's Madonna and Child. It's the image that we have on the right. How is this no longer Gothic? How is this no longer Gothic? I put an example of Duccio's Madonna and Child on the left as a comparison for you. So go ahead and put in the chat, how is this a departure from the late Gothic? So I'd like to get everyone to comment on this one. Okay, so I'm kind of looking through you guys' answers. And so in the background, right, we have much more detail in it. It doesn't just have a sense of gold, right? It's not just emulating Byzantine, but there's a sense of visual depth there. It has visual depth Got 2 of those. It has a lot more realistic detail. It has much more realistic proportions. It's much more 3D. So even though Duccio's has modeling, it doesn't necessarily look completely realistic. Okay. Sorry, my chat hid up behind something on me. There we go. Okay, so here we have some kind of departures. So Madonna and Childs don't disappear. And so we have other artists like Frau Angelica, Masaccio doing these Mary and child imagery. But you can see how they're very different than what we just saw when we looked at late Gothic, right? So when we look at the style of it, we want to think about how it is a Renaissance painting. And most of you guys were able to put that into the chat. So we want to describe the style. But another thing we want to focus on is the status of the artist and how it changes in the Renaissance. It's at the very end of the Smart History article. If you're really interested, we'll go over the basics of it, right? So just like you guys were mentioning in your discussion, it has a sense of modeling to it. So when I say modeling, I'm talking about light and shadow. When we look at her, and we especially like if we look at her clothing and we look at this little angel's clothing, we can see that it has a consistent light source. The light shining in from the right, and so we have realistic shadows, we have realistic drapery. The figure seems very 3D, right? It doesn't seem flat, it doesn't feel stylized. There's a sense of realism. If you look at her, like her head wrap, you can see that the fabric is like translucent. You can see through it, right? And so it's thin. You can see the detail behind it. They do use linear perspective in this. The background, right, is landscape, but the frame has a sense of linear perspective to it so that it looks three-dimensional. And then the halo here feels more like a real halo than a symbol of a halo. So instead of being a circle that's flat, it's an ellipse, and it even has light and shadow to it. And so it feels like it's going back into space and coming in front of her head, right? So Frau Filippo Lippi, as well as many of these Renaissance artists, we know a lot about them because people like Vasari write about them. So we have a little bit later architect who writes about the lives of the artist. And Lippi was a monk, and he was notorious as a genius, but also as a womanizer, which seems a little odd for a monk, right? But it was pretty common for the Pope of the day to have a mistress and have a few children, as well as priests and monks as well. But Lippi, Frau Filippo Lippi, he was kind of viewed as a genius. He was very respected, but he was kind of allowed to be bad because he was so brilliant as an artist. And so this idea that even though he's kind of unseemly or not kind of living up to what the church exactly would want for him, because he was such a genius, he was allowed to be improper by the church. And so some of the things that he did was he ran away from his patrons. So he'd hide away from commissions. You know, he'd get money and then leave. He did forgery. So he faked artwork. He kidnapped a nun. He had affairs, and he had many children. And he was one of the first artists that was known in his own lifetime. So people knew of his artistic greatness, as well as probably a little bit of his notoriety of being kind of a womanizer of the day. But he was mostly known as a genius. So this is kind of a difference between a medieval craftsperson who is anonymous to now knowing the greatness of an artist because that they were able to achieve so much in their field. Right? So in the foreground, in the background, we talked about the background in our discussion, but what's in the foreground? What's all this imagery that we have here? Right? So we have the Virgin sitting in prayer at a slight angle so that the viewer can see as much information as possible, right? Her body casts a shadow on the window and the frame behind her. So instead of the frame being on the outside, notice how it becomes part of that space, right? There's a sense of overlap. Please be writing notes as you go. This will save you guys a lot on time, right? The Madonna, right, in this image is viewed as a young, beautiful mother, right? She's probably in a Florentine home, and I can see that based on the chair that she's sitting on. You can notice the detail here in the bottom left, right? And then on the other side of her, we have her holding the Christ child, and then we have, I assume, two angels. We really only see the angel in the foreground. There's just the little face of another one kind of in the background. And he seems a little mischievous, right? They say, in Smart History, they say a puckish grin. So the puck, of course, is an allusion to Shakespeare, kind of this mischievous little sprite who is refusing to behave in this kind of pious sort of setting, right? So, of course, when we think about, this is not necessarily Shakespeare, but this idea of mischievous is kind of like tongue-in-cheek. This would be kind of a courtly piece rather than a super religious piece. So that connection with patrons again, right? So then in the background, we said that in the chat that we have this landscape behind them. But besides that rock formation behind Jesus's head, we also have a distant city, and that distant city is supposed to be heavenly Jerusalem. We've talked about heavenly Jerusalem. It's this concept that comes from Revelations. And so this idea of a place that you go after you die, right? After you live forever in this heavenly Jerusalem if you are, not full of sin and that you embrace Jesus. Right? There also is a body of water, and there's a river back here. And that's supposed to relate to the association of Mary's association with the sea. And then there's this emphasis on the pearl. And so she wears pearls. She's got pearls in her hair. There's pearls dangling from the furniture. And that's all products of the sea. So once again, an allusion to her connectiveness to it. And that is very much a concept of Neoplatoism. This concept of the Virgin is very much something that we see, especially like in the Botticelli that we're going to see, this connection between her and Mary. Right. So Neoplatoism, right, is a philosophy and religious system developed in the 3rd century. And it's basically combining Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and the Stoics with elements of Oriental mysticism. Now, I don't think you need to really worry about that. But what I want you to focus on is the concept of it's supposed to, right, be how does the human soul rise above the imperfect world towards contemplation and knowledge of the transcendent one. So it's often talking about the imperfections of man, right? And trying to rectify the physical world and the spiritual world, right? So the physical and the spiritual, right? You can observe the real world, you see how it works, but then how do you justify the spiritual or the unseen? How do you create those relationships? And so Neo-Plato philosophers, artists, musicians, writers, and so on were under the patronage of Lorenzo the Medici. We often call him Lorenzo the Magnificent, right? So you can see kind of the power that he wielded. And so they, in his inner circle, would often kind of define an understanding of the world. And they often thought of the understanding of spiritual beauty derived from this philosophy. So we have her seeming very beautiful to kind of represent that, that spiritual beauty is supposed to, that transcendence of the other world. And so if you would compare her to the vestibule or the Röntgen Pietà, right? How are we supposed to relate, right? In this one, she is there to emphasize brokenness, sin, hardship. We're supposed to relate to her in that we have sympathy. She has empathy for our hardship. Here, right, she's much more beautiful. What could that be symbolic of? If I were standing in front of this one, I might start crying. What would I probably do if I were standing in front of this one? The one on the left. Brianna, do you have any opinion on that?
Like, maybe like comforted.
Exactly. She's much more peaceful. She's beautiful. She would she would just probably make you feel so much better about what's going on in your life. She'd bring you a sense of peace rather than maybe be suffering alongside you. And she very much comes into our space. The idea of her breaking the frame makes it more personable. Okay, so the last artist that we have is Botticelli. And Botticelli was a favorite of the Medicis as well as a lot of the social elite of the day. And so a lot of his paintings are based on classical stories. So this one is, oh golly, I'm having a hard time today remembering the names of things. This one has Medici oranges at the tops. But here we have the three graces, very symbolic of the perfect wife. So these would be characteristics that a woman would have. This was a marriage gift. I think this was also a marriage gift here on the left with the Birth of Venus. So we have our Birth of Venus by Botticelli. Interesting to mention, as you kind of open up your note takers to 72, Botticelli is known for his classical works, but by the end of his career, he becomes uber religious. There was a priest who was kind of like shaking up the Catholic Church, and he was kind of like a fire and brimstone kind of preacher. He spoke of damnation and kind of, what would happen if you were so sinful. And so Botticelli actually changes his style at the end and actually destroys a lot of his classically inspired pieces. The ones that are around today were in the collection of the Medici, and so he wasn't able to kind of get at them. But the reason I bring that up is Michelangelo was a follower of this minister as well. And Michelangelo always shows this idea of the turmoil within himself in his paintings, this idea of suffering, which is very characteristic of Michelangelo as we kind of learn more about him in the upcoming days. So Birth of Venus, right? So a little bit of background. Botticelli was a Florentine master. He was, like I said, employed by the Medici, and he had an intense interest in the Quattrocento humanist scholars. So remember, Quattrocento is the 1300s, right? And this is where we see Florence taking kind of like having its kind of like spotlight on it as a great center of the world, or at least the Western world. And it's a place of art and literature and learning through the classics. And so they're reinterpreting all of this philosophy in the lens of Christianity, right? Neoplatoism is trying to make the connection between philosophy and Christianity. And so this one is based on a poem by a humanist of the day. Of course, Venus, right, is classical, but this one comes from a poem by Angelo Palazzino of the day, right? So what is the story that's taking place, right? Let's go ahead and just describe what we see. Does Venus come in as a baby? No, right? She comes in as a full-grown woman, right? And when she's born, she comes from the sea, right? And so these two figures on the left, what are they doing? What are the two figures on the left doing? Emily, what do you think? What are the two figures on the left doing?
They're like witnessing her coming from the sea.
Look at their mouths. What are their mouths doing?
They're kind of like shocked or like surprised, or like the mouths are like wide open.
Well, the woman is, but the man is blowing. They're actually blowing her in from the sea. They're the ones who are bringing her arrival. And then we have a woman on the right side, right? And what is she doing? What is she doing? Raheel, what do you think? The person on the right, what do you think they're doing?
They're kind of like covering her up with, like, a
Right?
piece of
So she's coming nude and they're like, oh, let's go and cover you up, right? From left to right, we have Zephyr and Chloris, and they blow her in from the sea. Venus comes born from a shell and arrives from the sea. And her devotee, this could be maybe one of the hours. So remember the three graces or the hours. This could be one of the hours where they are waiting to cover her up, right? And so this idea of Venus being born from the sea, she's often, and I'm sure this is coming up in another slide, is a symbol of Mary. So even though this is a classical story, this is a pagan story, it's symbolic of Christianity. In the Frau Filippo Lippi piece, remember how Mary had elements of the pearl and the sea? Here it's kind of like, this is the connection with Venus, and she's coming from the shell, right? So they often equate Venus with Mary, or being symbolic of Mary. Right? So what are the early characteristics viewed in this piece? What tells us that this is Renaissance and not Gothic or not medieval? What's Renaissance about it? Kwana, can you help?
It's very realistic and detailed.
Right? So it's got realistic detail and modeling of light and shadow. It looks 3D, right? There's a lot of details or realistic details in the fabric, in the background, in the hair, that sort of thing. Is there linear perspective here? Not really. You might see a little bit in the trees as they kind of go back into space, but because it doesn't have architecture, there's no real linear perspective here like there is in the Frau Filippo piece in the border. And then anatomy. What about the anatomy is classical? Alana, what do you think?
There's a very big emphasis on it. It's very realistic.
Right? And she's nude, right? When we look at her, she's classically nude. So we have a female nude. So we saw with David, the male nude. Here we have the female nude, right? And so when we think about where this is coming from, it's coming from those classical sculptures that we had in the late classical period of Greece, right? We have the contrapposto, right? We have the covering of your body. Notice how her hand covers her chest, her other hand and her hair covers her other area. She's there, you know, kind of in a modest sort of way, right? Is there something a little off about her that's not quite perfectly classical? Anything a little off about her? Doesn't she feel like she has a really small head and long torso? Her proportions are just a little off. Another thing she has is that she's outlined. So there's a strong outline or contour to her that's very similar to some of the Greek pottery that we saw. She doesn't look flat, but she's got like an outline around her body as well. Right? So here's some examples of Botticelli's more religious pieces. These are pieces that he painted in the Sistine Chapel. Before Michelangelo does the ceiling, there's a whole series of early Renaissance painter who basically paints the walls. And so Botticelli was one of those, right? And so Neoplatoism, right? We're going to focus on this. We're going to have us watch the video on this, and we're going to think about how it represents philosophy and also how it represents Christian imagery of the day. And then we'll end with that. Because in all honesty, they speak about it better than I could.
We're in probably the most crowded gallery at the Uffizi here in Florence. This is the room that contains Botticelli's fabulously beautiful Birth of Venus.
And you can hear the hubbub around us. But it's interesting that the Birth of Venus is a painting that we actually know very little about. We don't know who it was painted for. We don't know where it was originally intended to be seen. The subject, a full-length nude female, is highly unusual, especially for the 15th century.
We do see nudes in medieval art and even in Renaissance art before this, but the nudes are usually Adam and Eve.
And beginning in the 15th century, artists do begin to experiment with introducing heroic male nudity within a biblical context. Think, for instance, of Donatello's David. But here we have something exceptional. This is an almost life-size, full-length female nude that is fully pagan in its subject matter.
Pagan and undoubtedly the goddess of love. Although the artists of the Renaissance are looking back to ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, many of which were nudes, they've in the past transformed them into a Christian biblical subject. Here, Venus remains Venus.
In fact, nudity in Christian art was often an expression of something traumatic. We see Christ almost nude on the cross, or we see the sinful being led into hell. What makes this painting so exceptional is that it is perhaps one of the first almost life-size representations of a female nude that is fully mythological in its subject matter.
She covers her body very much the way Eve covered hers when she was expelled from the Garden of Eden. But here we have a gesture of modesty, not one of shame. Venus floats on a seashell. She's born from the sea.
And because we're talking about classical mythology, she can be born fully grown.
And here she is blown by the west wind Zephyr, and we see his body entwined with the body of Chloris.
On the right, we see an attendant who's ready to wrap the newborn goddess. Although all of these figures clearly represent Botticelli's incredibly sophisticated understanding of the human body. Look at the wonderful sway of Venus, or the complex intertwining of the two figures on the left. And despite the fact that we see a very deep space, the canvas feels flat. And this is the result of a number of things. For one thing, the emphasis on pattern. Botticelli has strewn the left side of the canvas with flowers, which are very close to the foreground. The right side, we have flowers again, but now they're part of the dress worn by the attendant and part of the cloth that she carries. The rhythmic alternation of light and dark in the scallop shell seems to push the back forward. And even the little V's that refer to the waves of the sea create a sense of two-dimensionality. So that the entire canvas, although depicting a deep space, is also so heavily patterned that it reminds us of its own two-dimensionality.
And the figures all occupy the same plane. That is, one figure isn't behind another or deeper into space than another. And so it does read very flatly. But I would also argue that although Botticelli does have an understanding of human anatomy, and we can see that clearly in the body of Venus or in the figure of the West Wind, or the way that we see the drapery wrapping around the figure of the nymph on the right, the figures are weightless. They don't stand firmly on the ground the way that we often expect Renaissance figures to stand. And the figure of Venus forms this serpentine shape that actually I think would be an impossible way to stand.
Certainly when you're surfing to shore on a seashell. Look, for example, the way that the artist has highlighted her golden hair with actual lines of gold. Gold that also appears in the foliage to the upper right and can be seen in the trunks of the trees that form the grove at the right.
Venus tilts her head slightly. Her hair blows in the wind and surrounds the curve of her body and is brought down in front of her to cover her modestly. Although there may be meaning behind this painting that connects classical mythology to certain Christian ideas via a philosophy called Neoplatoism, what we're looking at essentially is still an incredibly beautiful and erotic image. This is a celebration of both beauty and of love. And we can think about that in both a secular context and a Christian one.
So remember that the female nude was not common, right? Other than in images of Eve. And so this shows us that during the Renaissance, people were becoming more accommodating and more lenient on that kind of imagery. But also remember that Botticelli would have been protected by the Medici, who were probably the patrons of this piece. And they would have viewed it as an image that not just represents Venus, but also represents the Christian image of Mary. There's an emphasis on that physical beauty, right? But the spiritual element of this is that it's a symbol of divine beauty, right? Divine beauty. And that divine beauty would be of Mary, the mother of Jesus. This concept of Venus being born from the water could equate to baptism waters that washes away sins of Christians. Divine love would be represented, could represent this idea of Jesus and the sacrifice that he gave for his followers, right? The wind gods, so like Chloris, the western winds, he could represent an eagle, an angel, not an eagle, sorry. Yep. Right? So those are some of those ways that they create Christian illusions through classical inspiration or classical symbolism. Any questions on early Renaissance? So on Thursday, we'll move into our other Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We have Raphael, and we have Leonardo, and then Raphael, and then we'll probably get started with Michelangelo. I doubt we'll finish Michelangelo though. Questions, concerns as you go? If you have any, feel free to ask on your way out.